Have you ever locked your doors at night, certain that you were safe only to feel a shadow pressing against the walls, watching, waiting? Imagine living in a city where the very silence after midnight felt like a warning. This is not fiction. This is the true story of a figure who stalked the streets of New Orleans in 1918 and 1919. His name was never discovered, his face never seen, but his weapon was always the same, an axe. They called him the Axeman of New Orleans, and to this day, his legend sends shivers down the spines of those who remember. This is not just a crime story, it is a haunting, a nightmare that unfolded in the jazz-soaked streets of Louisiana when families realized that even in the comfort of their homes, death could slip in through the dark. It began quietly. In May of 1918, a grocer named Joseph Maggio and his wife, Catherine, were found butchered in their bedroom. Their throats had been slit with a razor, their skulls smashed with an axe that belonged to Joseph himself. Blood painted the walls, and yet nothing in the house had been stolen. The killer hadn't come for money. He had come for something else, something darker. The police were baffled. The back door had been chiseled open as if someone had carefully removed a panel to reach inside. The axe was left behind, discarded as though it had never mattered. Neighbors spoke of strange noises in the night, the sound of footsteps vanishing into the shadows. But no one had seen the killer. No one even heard the screams until it was too late. People whispered that it had to be personal. Perhaps a jealous lover, perhaps a business rival. But then, just weeks later, another family was attacked. This time, the weapon was the same, the method eerily similar. The killer broke into homes at night, used their own axes against them, and vanished without a trace. Fear spread like wildfire. The papers began calling him the Axeman. New Orleans was no stranger to crime or bloodshed, but this was different. The attacks seemed random. Grocers, families, men, women, no one was safe. The victims had no clear connection, and the killer. He left no trail, no fingerprints, no witnesses. Only blood. People stopped sleeping at night. They nailed their doors shut, set traps, bought dogs to guard their homes. Still, the killings continued. Families woke to the sound of splintering wood, the cold realization that the devil himself had entered their homes. By August, panic had gripped the city. Every shadow seemed suspicious. Every creak in the night could be the Axeman's footstep. But what made him truly horrifying wasn't just his brutality, it was his voice. On March 13th, 1919, the city's newspaper received a letter. It was long, rambling, and written in a strange, taunting style. The writer claimed to be the Axeman himself. He spoke of being a demon, a creature from the hottest hell. He mocked the police for failing to catch him, and then he gave a chilling ultimatum. He wrote that on Tuesday night, March 19th, he would once again prowl the streets of New Orleans. And on that night, he promised to spare only those homes where a jazz band was playing. Everyone shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing, the letter declared. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. The city went mad with terror. People scrambled to hire musicians, packed dance halls, and filled their homes with music, hoping to appease the unseen killer. On that night, jazz echoed through every corner of New Orleans, the sound of trumpets and pianos rising like a shield against death itself. And whether by coincidence or something far stranger, no one was killed that night. But the silence afterward was even worse, because everyone knew the Axeman would be back. No one knew who he was. No one knew why he killed. But as the summer of 1919 dragged on, the city braced for the next strike. People whispered theories. Was he a maniac obsessed with music? A serial killer with a twisted sense of humor? Or was he, as he claimed, something not human at all. The truth was more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. And the next attack would prove that the Axeman was not finished with New Orleans. Not yet. The night after the jazz ultimatum passed, New Orleans didn't breathe a sigh of relief, it only held its breath tighter. People had danced and played their instruments as if their lives depended on it, and perhaps they had been spared. But no one believed the Axeman was truly gone. His promise was not an ending. It was a warning. In the weeks that followed, families barely slept. Men kept shotguns by their beds. Mothers clutched their children through the night, whispering prayers that the sound of footsteps would pass them by. Every creak of the house, every groan of the old wooden walls felt like death moving closer. Then, on the hot night of August 10th, 1919, the silence shattered again. That night, a young woman named Esther Pepitone woke to a scream that did not sound human. It came from her mother's room. Esther rushed in to find her stepfather, Mike Pepitone, sprawled across the floor, his head split open by an axe. Blood splattered across the walls in thick, horrible strokes. Her mother was weeping uncontrollably, shaking, unable to explain what had happened. The killer had vanished into the night, leaving the Pepitone family destroyed. But here's the part that terrified the city most. The method was the same. The panel in the back door had been carefully removed. The axe was left behind, slick with blood. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing except the sense of safety in a man's own home. By now, it was undeniable. This was no series of coincidences. It was one man, one monster, slipping in and out of homes like a shadow. The newspapers began printing the word terror. New Orleans was no stranger to crime, but this was different. This was chaos. This was a killer who obeyed no pattern, no logic, no human reason. He didn't rob. He didn't hide his weapons. He didn't even care if people were awake. He came, he killed, and he disappeared. And always, always, there was an axe. Police worked desperately to catch him. They questioned neighbors, dragged in suspects, even accused Italian-American grocers of being involved in some secret vendetta, but there was never enough evidence. The killer slipped through their fingers like smoke, and the people of New Orleans began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the Axeman really was what he claimed in his letter, a demon from hell. The summer of 1919 became a season of dread. People reported seeing figures lurking in alleyways, shadows slipping through gardens, strange sounds scratching against windows. Dogs barked endlessly at nothing. Families stayed awake all night, only to collapse from exhaustion in the day. The city had become a sleepless place, and then the attacks grew bolder. In one case, a woman named Pauline Bruno reported hearing heavy footsteps in her home. She screamed, and the sound fled into the night. When police arrived, they found her door panel had been pried open, and an axe lay abandoned in the grass. The Axeman had been there. He had been watching her as she slept. Another victim, Charles Cortimiglia, a grocer, and his wife were brutally attacked in their home, while their infant daughter was asleep nearby. Charles survived, but his wife was found barely clinging to life, her skull fractured. Their neighbors swore they heard nothing. The silence of the city was like a mask hiding screams that never reached beyond the walls. It was as though the Axeman moved with the city itself, a ghost blending into the humid air, slipping past locked doors and bolted shutters. By September, rumors spread that the Axeman had supernatural powers. Some believed he could vanish into thin air, or that he lived in the attics of homes, watching families until the perfect night arrived. Others whispered that he was not one man at all, but a curse and echo of something dark, awakened by the city's sins. And while people speculated, he struck again. This time, the victim was a grocer named Steve Boca. He was attacked in his bed, his head split open by a blow so violent it left blood across the walls. Yet somehow, miraculously, he survived. Stumbling from his home, drenched in blood, he collapsed into the street and was rushed to a hospital. When questioned, he could only shake his head. He had never seen his attacker. The shadows had no face. That was the horror of the Axeman. No one could describe him. Not a single survivor had seen his face clearly. He was not tall, not short, not young, not old. He was simply there and then gone, a phantom with an axe. By late 1919, New Orleans was unraveling. Jazz still poured from every corner, not as celebration, but as a desperate word against death. And still, people knew it was only a matter of time before the Axeman returned. But what no one expected was that his story would not end in New Orleans. It would spread, following survivors, trailing grief, and leaving open wounds that would never heal. Because while the city tried to move on, the Axeman's shadow remained. And for some, the nightmare was only beginning. The fall of 1919 settled heavy over New Orleans, but it brought no relief from the terror. The city was alive with jazz at night, but beneath the music was fear so sharp it felt like a second heartbeat. Every man who closed his eyes feared he would never open them again. Every woman who kissed her children goodnight wondered if she'd wake to find them gone. The Axeman had transformed the Crescent City into a hunting ground. The police tried to fight back. Patrols increased. Officers roamed neighborhoods after dark, searching for suspicious figures, but the killer seemed to vanish when watched. He always returned to strike when people felt least prepared. On September 3rd, 1919, the city awoke to yet another nightmare. A grocer named Steve Boca staggered into the street in the early hours, drenched in blood, his skull cracked open. He had been sleeping when the Axeman struck. Somehow, he managed to stumble from his home before collapsing in the road. He lived, but like all survivors before him, he could not describe the man who had attacked him. The pattern was uncheckable. The back door pried open, the axe often the victim's own used as the weapon. Nothing stolen, nothing explained. The people of New Orleans grew wild with suspicion. Neighbors accused one another. Angry mobs shouted outside police stations, demanding justice. Some claimed the Axeman was Italian. Others swore he was a jealous rival, or a mad butcher who walked the markets by day. Still others whispered that he was not human at all, but a demon who thrived on blood. And then the killing struck closer to the heart of the city. On October 27th, the screams of Sarah Lauman shattered the quiet of her neighborhood. Neighbors rushed to find her lying unconscious in her bed, her skull fractured, blood soaking the sheets. Miraculously, she survived. Once again, her attacker had vanished without a sound. Her axe was found discarded on the porch. The police were humiliated. Each new attack only proved how powerless they were. Reporters wrote headlines that screamed of incompetence. The public's faith collapsed. Even the mayor's office admitted New Orleans was under siege. The killer's cruelty seemed to grow bolder with every strike. It was no longer enough to break into homes and kill. He wanted to terrify, to make people know he was there. By December, people claimed to hear the sound of footsteps outside their windows at night. Dogs barked endlessly, their howls echoing across darkened streets. One woman swore she heard a faint humming, a tune whistled just outside her home before her door creaked and a panel splintered. She screamed, and the shadow fled into the night. The paranoia grew unbearable. Families began sleeping in shifts, one person awake while the others rested. Men sharpened knives and kept them by their beds. Guns sold out in shops. Musicians played through the night, their jazz loud enough to drown out their fear. And yet, despite every precaution, the Axeman returned again. On March 10th, 1919, one of the bloodiest attacks of all struck the Cortimiglia family. Charles and Rosie were grocers, respected in their neighborhood. That night, they were awakened by the figure of a man standing over their bed. Before they could scream, the axe came down. Charles was struck hard across the head, blood exploding across the sheets. Rosie tried to protect her infant daughter, but the killer swung again, striking the child. The baby was killed instantly. Rosie's cries echoed through the house as she and Charles lay broken and bleeding. When neighbors arrived, the scene was almost too horrific to describe. The walls were painted in red. The tiny body of the infant was lifeless. Charles survived. Rosie did too, but their marriage never recovered. Rosie testified in court, accusing a neighbor she believed was the killer. Later, she withdrew her statement, confessing she had been pressured by police desperate for a conviction. The accused man was freed, and the Axeman remained at large. But the terror he left in that home was permanent. The image of a murdered child shattered whatever fragile sense of safety the city had left. By now, the Axeman wasn't just a killer, he was a legend. Children whispered his name in fear. Men claimed they'd seen him vanish into thin air, slipping between shadows like smoke. Some said he was a spirit of vengeance, punishing the city for its sins. Others swore he was a failed musician, mad with jealousy, striking down grocers and families because they represented something he had lost. But the truth was more horrifying. No one knew anything. No one knew when he would strike next. No one knew why he killed. No one knew if he watched from the crowd as people buried their dead. The only certainty was this: the Axeman of New Orleans was still out there. And though the city prayed for an end, the most chilling chapter of his reign of terror was yet to come. The winter of 1919 passed into spring, and though the city tried to move forward, the shadow of the Axeman clung like a second skin. Every night, families listened for the faintest soundwood creaking, footsteps on the porch, the scrape of metal against a lock. The police had nothing. Survivors couldn't describe him. The only solid evidence was the chilling letter he had sent, boasting of his power, demanding jazz as his tribute. Even the most skeptical citizens wondered if the writer had been telling the truth. Was the Axeman more than a man? The killing slowed after March, but that didn't bring comfort. It only deepened the paranoia, because everyone knew silence meant waiting. Silence meant the Axeman was choosing his next home. And then came the final murder. On October 27th, 1919, Mike Pepitone was found in his bedroom, his skull crushed by an axe. Blood painted the walls in wide, violent arcs, and his wife's screams carried through the neighborhood. It was the same method, the same nightmare. The city was gripped in horror once again. But this time, something was different. After Pepitone's death, the Axeman vanished. Completely. There were no more attacks. No more doors broken open in the night. No more families butchered in their beds. The city waited, week after week, month after month, but the killing stopped. And just like that, the reign of the Axeman ended. For New Orleans, it was almost worse than the murders themselves. There was no closure, no capture, no trial. The monster who had terrorized an entire city slipped into the darkness as easily as he had entered it. His face was never seen, his name never known. He left only a trail of blood and a legend that would never die. Speculation consumed the years that followed. Some believed he had died, killed in some unrelated crime or sickness, his body buried in an unmarked grave. Others insisted he had moved on, carrying his axe to another city, another set of victims whose stories were lost to time. And some believed the Axeman was never a man at all. The letter he had written mocking the police, declaring himself a demon from the hottest hell. Was that only the sick humor of a human monster, or was it something else? People whispered that the reason he was never caught was because he couldn't be caught, because he wasn't bound by human laws or human hands. The survivors carried the scars for the rest of their lives. Rosie Cortimiglia never recovered from the night her baby was taken. Esther Pepitone, who had found her stepfather dead, lived haunted by nightmares until her death. And countless families who lived through that year never slept soundly again. Even decades later, Old men in New Orleans would lower their voices when speaking of him. Mothers would warn their children, lock the doors or the axeman will come. And what of the jazz? That one night in March when the entire city played music to keep death at bay? No one could ever explain it. Why didn't he kill that night? Was it coincidence? Was it mockery? Or had the axeman truly been listening, roaming the streets, smiling as horns blared and pianos shook the walls? Perhaps the cruelest truth is this: we will never know. The Axeman of New Orleans remains one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. He appeared without warning, murdered without mercy, and disappeared without trace. He left behind no motive, no face, and no end, only fear. And maybe, just maybe, that's why his story still chills us today. Because when you lie in bed at night, when you hear a noise at the window or the groan of wood in the floorboards, you remember. You remember that once in the darkened streets of New Orleans, there was someone or something that came for families in their sleep, and who's to say he's not still out there? Listening, waiting, axe in hand.